reacting, certainly for trade and globalization supporters like us, sort of the reaction has been shock and sort of disbelief of sort of how the trade debate has evolved, with both major candidates now not endorsing TPP. But I think it opens up an opportunity to really look more deeply at what actually is happening in the U.S. body politic, and what is the cause of this focus, or this reaction, if you will. So we have a really excellent panel today. I'm just going to introduce folks quickly. I'm going to make some opening remarks. We'll hear from everybody for 8-10 minutes. We'll have a little discussion, then we'll open it up for questions and comments. Clyde is not here yet, but when he comes, I'll introduce him. Carolyn Freund is the senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Prior to that, she was the chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and had other positions at the World Bank for a number of years, and then was an economist at the Federal Reserve Board. Dan Eikenson is the director of Cato's Herbert A. Steffel Center on Trade Policy Studies. He's done work for years and years and years on trade policy at Cato, which he joined in 2000, authored dozens of papers, particularly focusing on U.S.-China trade relations. And finally, John Baranow is a partner at Covington and Burling, which is a DC-based law firm, and his practice focuses on international trade matters. He also was in Senate-confirmed positions in Republican and Democratic administrations under President Bush. He was a deputy U.S. Trade Representative and a USTR General Counsel. And under President Clinton, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs. So, I'll jump right in. The key question, I think, is as we've seen with the faith in globalization and the trust in trade going down, the skepticism of more trade agreements, what's that all about? And I think the fundamental question is this based on sort of false consciousness on the masses' part? Do they just haven't taken enough economics classes? And if we just spoke a little louder and a little more clearly, enunciating trade is good, they would realize the error of their ways? Or perhaps people are on to something maybe that Washington hasn't fully realized. And I think that's the key question. I think many in the trade establishment just sort of ascribe blame to the unwashed masses and say, well, they either don't really know enough, or sure, there's a few people who've been hurt by trade, and let's expand TAA, give them a little more help, and then everything will be fine. I don't think that the way that the trade establishment has talked about this is very productive. Greg Mankiw wrote a piece I believe in the New York Times, where he talked about trade opponents as, quote, less educated isolationists. That's a kind of disparaging view. It sort of implies that people who don't really support globalization and trade today are less enlightened. They haven't taken haven't read Mankiw's book on economics. Probably a good thing also if you've ever read that book. So that's kind of the view that, wake up, smell the coffee, get with the program. Sure, a few people might get hurt, but it's a good thing. Let me suggest that that's a partially flawed explanation and a partially flawed guide to going forward to fixing trade policy. I think the Washington trade establishment's view is grounded in 4 key assumptions that lead them to think in a certain way. The first one is that that America is the global economic leader, always will be, always has been. And that's just because we're the most open, market-driven, and entrepreneurial economy, so we're just going to win all the time. That was true in the post-war period, but it certainly is not true now. We face very, very intense competitors, very, very, very well-qualified competitors all around the world, and they're competing directly for the major industries that America has competitive advantage in. We can't just assume that we're always going to win. The second core belief among many in the trade establishment is that trade is an unalloyed good, even if it's only one-sided free trade. In other words, if we're open and the other side is not, that trade with that other side is going to be an unalloyed good. One person, an emblematic statement on this, William Boudier, former head of the European Bank for Reconstruction, quote, "Remember, unilateral trade liberalization is not a concession or sacrifice, it is an act of enlightened self-interest. Reciprocal trade liberalization enhances the gains, but is not necessary for those gains to be present." In other words, you get gains even if the other side is not liberalizing their trade regime. And I think that's just fundamentally false. So when we're trading with with the Canadians, sure, we get gains. You know, we might complain a little bit, or they complain about software or lumber, and we complain about something else. But by and large, both Canada and the U.S. abide by the global trading rules, and more of those agreements are good for us. But there are certainly countries that aren't like Canada, that are inherently mercantilist in their policies, and the notion that somehow trading with them is inherently good, or that it would be even better if they were not mercantilists, I think is a false view. Third, there's this notion of comparative advantage that I think the trade establishment has bought into, essentially saying that it doesn't really matter what our industrial structure is. It could evolve in any way. If we lose, I won't say who it was, but the head of a major trade think tank in Washington was asked once, would it be okay if because of globalization we lost every single manufacturing firm in America? And his answer was, sure, why not? Because we'd be doing something else. So there's this notion that it really doesn't matter what you make, that whatever our comparative advantage is if it happens to be in waste paper, which is, by the way, a huge export from the U.S. We have competitive advantage in waste paper now, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. And then last, I think, core belief in the trade establishment is that overall trade is a good thing, which, by the way, we believe as long as it's real trade. But if it's even if it's mercantilist trade with our competitors, the view is that overall it's a good thing, and it just hurts a few people. So Tufts professor Daniel Dresner is emblematic of that when he says, even if the aggregate gains have massively outweighed the losses, it's hard to deny that trade has wreaked some serious carnage on some parts of the American economy. And that's sort of the conventional view. Some places get hurt, some communities get hurt, some workers get hurt, but overall it's a good thing. So let me just be clear by saying we fully support total global integration, fully support that. And some people will get hurt by that, and that's too bad, but it's going to be good for the globe and it's going to be good for the U.S. What we don't support, and what we do think has been very harmful overall to the U.S. economy, is the rise of systemic mercantilism over the last decade. And so for the trade establishment, they, I think, have backed themselves into a corner, and there's really, it's kind of, you're either in one of two camps. You either sort of accept trade the way it is, and or you're a protectionist. And I think by framing it that way, you've forced a lot of people into the Trump camp. If there's no sort of middle ground, there's no third position, a lot of these people will say, fine, I will support Trumpism and protectionism. So I think if we have any hope of turning popular sentiment away from protectionism, we have to do more than just sort of offer up the fig leaf of more assistance for unemployed workers, or the false narrative that it's all technology's fault and trade has had no impact. I think rather what we need to start doing is talk about two core problems that are at the heart of making of keeping America from fully benefiting from 21st century globalization. The first is the recognition that despite the WTO, many nations still no longer play by global rules. They steal intellectual property. They force U.S. companies to transfer their technology for market access. They engage in massive subsidies. China's a case in point right now, where they're putting $140 billion into subsidizing a semiconductor industry. This cannot be good for the world, and it certainly will not be good for the U.S. economy. Now, luckily, there's some progress. I would point to the WTO case yesterday on Airbus. What a wonderful decision. WTO panel ruled that Airbus would not have sold a single jet over the last 6 years without launch aid. This is just completely inappropriate behavior on the Europeans' part to have massive subsidies for Airbus. WTO ruling says you can't do it. We'll see now whether that ruling, which was a second ruling, because the first ruling said it was a violation, and then this ruling basically yesterday said, yeah, you haven't fixed it. So we'll see whether it's fixed. But I think that's really at the nub of where the trade establishment has to go, is to put market opening, put trade enforcement on the same level, if you will, as market opening. And largely a lot of the focus has been on market opening and not on market enforcement, trade enforcement. So again, to be clear, we fully support the TPP. We will have a report coming out soon on why much of the, if not most, if not all of the criticisms of the TPP are really fallacious. But what we also support is strong trade enforcement. And then the second big problem, I think, is a lot of trade supporters will talk about, oh, if we just open up, we will do well because somehow we'll get our inherent comparative advantage. But I think it's really a fantasy to think that if we just open up, that we're going to inherently do well without the complement of a domestic competitiveness strategy. How are we going to do well when we have the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD? How are we supposed to do well with that? Does that not have any effect on corporate location? So yeah, we can open up for other markets, but if we have the highest corporate tax rate, if we have a weak Ex-Im bank, if we don't have a highly skilled workforce because we're not supporting those kinds of policies, why would we automatically win? So I think it's incumbent upon supporters of globalization that if they want to win this debate, that when they go up to the Hill and talk about support for new trade agreements, they have to say, oh, by the way, you've got to reform the corporate tax code. Oh, by the way, you really have to support workforce training programs. Oh, by the way, you've got to support programs like the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation to help our companies with pre-competitive R&D. So let me just wrap up by saying I don't, for the moment, believe that if we did this, that all of a sudden trade opposition is going to go away. There are lots of folks who on the left who will reject globalization because they simply don't want competitive markets. They want to be able to have labor unions push for uncompetitive wages. They want to be able to have regulators regulate with impunity. So there's some on the left who just simply don't want globalization. They want a nationalized economy. There's others on the left who reject globalization because they hate large corporations. They think we should all eat rutabagas in the winter that are growing near our house, and all shop at worker-owned co-ops. That's a lot of what the TPP opposition is from. And those folks aren't going to change their tune. They're going to hate globalization no matter what. But I don't think most voters are in either of those camps. They're just kind of trying to get by on a daily basis. They're pragmatic. And I think if they saw that we were taking steps in Washington to, as I said, really enforce agreements, really push back on mercantilism around the world, and to have robust policies to make sure that firms in the U.S. can be more competitive and create high value-added jobs, then I think the tide would shift and people would become much more willing to support a robust globalization agenda from the U.S. government. So that's my hope, and I hope as we go forward in the next couple of years, as we kind of dig down and more into kind of looking at what's happened here, that we start to move more in that direction. I think if we do, then we will rightly be able to support globalization more effectively. So with that, Carolyn.
Thank you. I'm going to start by offering some reactions, and then I have 4 points that I want to make. But just as a couple of reactions, one thing is I actually think the core has changed. So whether you look at the academic literature, which no longer stresses comparative advantage, or you look at what people are writing, both top trade economists, whether it be Danny Roderick or Paul Krugman, or top think tanks, I think everybody's recognized that there have been a lot of challenges with globalization, though still believing it's a good thing. This morning I wrote in behind something pretty rare in DC, which is a Trump sticker. But the Trump sticker was on a Honda SUV. And so this is going to get into what I'm going to talk about, which is the benefits of trade, which is the first point I'm going to make. But then the final reaction is about Canada. There is something really broad going on in this pushback on trade, because this morning one of the other top news items besides the WTO was the contentious agreement between EU and Canada. Never in my life have I heard Canada and contentious in the same sentence. So I think, you know, it's not even just pushback against the typical low-wage countries in trade. It's a more general trade is bad. And I'm going to get to that with a point I want to make, that I think a big part of it isn't an elitist kind of they don't understand, but is actually xenophobia among a really large swath of the US population. So those are two of the points I'm going to make, benefits and xenophobia. The other two are about trade costs, who's getting hurt, and what can be done. So let me just start with some of the trade benefits. I think we know them, but I think it is useful to review them when you're thinking about trade. And the first one is, of course, low prices. If each country can make the thing they produce most efficiently, prices are lower. That's why the vehicle in front of me with the Trump sticker was a Honda. It's also a reason because of variety. People like to have variety. Imagine if we all only had the choice of American products. No avocados in winter. No variety in car choice from the high-end Mercedes to the Hyundai. An iPhone, you know, there have been studies, how much would an iPhone cost if it were made in the US? It's hard to say, because some say it can't even be made in the US because it uses 3/4 of the elements on the periodic table. But even if it was, it would be from $100 to up to $1,000 more if it were made here. Things would cost a lot more, so ultimately your real wage is lower. Productivity. New research has shown that firms are really different within an industry. So what trade does is it helps move industry to the most productive firms, which gives huge productivity gains. A lot of the gains don't come from the typical comparative advantage, but actually come from moving to the most productive firms, which expand abroad as trade grows. And finally, one of the biggest benefits is actually security. How do you get other countries to cooperate on issues you care about if you don't have some leverage? And trade gives you that leverage, because if you have something they want, our market, then sanctions can work. Sanctions can't work if you're already cut off. And that's how we can get countries to cooperate on things we care about, like environment or migration, or just being a good global citizen. And one other, and it's kind of a reaction to the previous speaker, is US is actually doing pretty well on competitiveness. And I think part of it is because it's been an open economy. Some research I'm doing is looking at the top 4 firms worldwide in 85 industries. So this is 340 global leaders. US has kept its share of global leaders, which is about nearly 30% since 2000. China's increased its share dramatically. The other end of China's gain has actually been the EU, not the US. US's open markets, open policies, access to finances have actually worked pretty well. But there are trade costs. Trade has, of course, affected manufacturing employment. Part of the 5 million lost manufacturing jobs since 2000 are due to trade. Economists estimate that 1 million are from China alone. There's another side of that, which is that research has gotten a lot of publicity, but there's other side of that in that service sectors and high-end sectors are growing. So the problem isn't necessarily that we're losing those routine jobs. Research shows it's actually the routine end of manufacturing we're losing. The problem is that some people don't have the skills to join the sectors that we're moving to. And the problem is that there are one-factory towns, which then tend to lose even more because of kind of scarring effects, where once the factory closes, research suggests, adjustment, people move into other sectors, but those specific towns don't have other sectors, and moving across the country isn't that easy for everybody. So these are the kind of issues we really have to deal with. And then finally, and where I agree with Rob very much, is on the unfair practices. So subsidies, currency manipulation, can tilt production against industries in a way that is distorting for the global economy. And the other part of this research looking at the top firms is where SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are present, we see concentration actually rising. So they are distorting global competition. Then the third point I want to make is the xenophobia point, that I believe the current wave of anti-globalization is not just about trade. In general, while I say the American corporations have done really well, they've also behaved badly. I mean, I think that Apple's low payment of taxes, in part because the U.S. system is so messed up, is unfair. The Panama Papers, corporations that have been hit in that kind of thing, incomes have stagnated. We're in an environment where big business is looking bad. Not all of it's justified. We need our big corporations. They provide the good jobs. They provide the productivity. I'm very pro big business. But when big business behaves badly, when CEOs get paid $20 million, $50 million, it is not helpful for the economy, and it's not helpful for the support of free trade and more generally free market policies. There's also this feeling, I think, and I think a lot of the kind of Make American Great is coming from this, of a decline of an empire. America's actually doing really well. As I said, the corporations are maintaining their share. But relatively speaking, there is another power out there. In 2014, China became the largest economy measured in real terms in the world. There is another power out there, and it's not a country we're typically aligned with. That changes things. And finally, security. Security threats, I think, have brought this connection with trade. People are afraid of things foreign. People are afraid of immigration, and that's a problem. If you look at the percentage of Trump supporters that don't like trade, it's about 2/3. But immigration and terrorism also rank 2/3. It's kind of the same 2/3 that blames their woes on foreigners. I think it's a lot easier to blame something that's very tangible than policy or their own decisions. So finally, and this is my fourth point, what can be done? I think we have to be careful of the pendulum swinging, that it swung, and I agree on the core values before of free trade is always good, everything about free trade is good, we can easily do adjustment, and even if we don't, it's a small group, it doesn't matter, to swinging now to the point where a number of people and top trade economists as well are saying, let's wait. No, we don't need more globalization now. Maybe we should even back up a little bit. I think that is equally dangerous. Trade is still good. We do have to figure out how to deal with these issues that are out there. But overall, the US has done very well with the policies. It has. Countries that have tried import substitution policies have universally failed. So while trade, open policies may not always be the best, one thing that's for sure is protectionism doesn't work. I will go to the trade adjustment assistance point. I do think we need more redistribution. We've really failed on that. Part of it was not realizing these scarring effects in towns. So we do need to figure out a better way of doing redistribution, of doing retraining, of doing vocational training. And finally, in terms of the rules, I actually think that's the direction of the new trade agreements, the TPP and TTIP. So it's somewhat ironic that the group that is opposed to trade is also opposed to these agreements, which actually set better rules on labor standards, on the environment, on state-owned enterprises, et cetera. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dan.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for inviting me. Rob and I are frequently skirmish on Twitter over issues like industrial policy, whether we need it or not, the state of the manufacturing sector, the meaning of the trade deficit. So it's good that we have civil discussions. Exactly. This is an election year. Trade is always maligned in presidential election years. I mean, going back to 1992, we had the giant sucking sound, Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. In 1996 and in 2000, we had the Buchanan brigades. Pat Buchanan actually won New Hampshire with an anti-trade message. In 2004, we had John Kerry talking about the Benedict Arnold companies that were outsourcing to India. In 2008, we had Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton battling over who was going to be more aggressive in reopening NAFTA. We had John Edwards talking about two Americas. In 2012, we had Mitt Romney and Barack Obama debating who was the bigger outsourcer. None of our politicians on the stump want to talk about the benefits of trade. They always want to use it in a provocative way to incite populist sort of reactions. But so there's nothing new in that sense. What is a little bit new, I think, is that trade has become sort of a catch-all for all sorts of economic anxieties. It's easy to point to trade if you're worried about your job, if you're worried about your future, if you think your wages are stagnant. It's pretty easy to blame foreigners, immigrants, foreign products. So to some extent, I think trade has become a casualty of the culture war. It's just another one of those issues. You see people inside the Beltway, in the big cities, who support trade, and people outside of those areas who are tending to fall out of love with it. Honestly, I don't think that we need to do a whole lot, to answer the question, what is needed to restore faith in trade and globalization? I think when people get the feeling that the economy is moving forward and that there are opportunities, this is going to disappear. This will disappear if and when Trump disappears. So I think that's something to keep in mind. It's funny, we're at 1101 K Street, and I'm working on a book, and it's called Free Trade for Free People, Taking Policy Back from K Street. So I point the finger at K Street for creating this environment of where fallacies persist.
What about Massachusetts Avenue?
Mass Ave, we're off limits. But when I say K Street, I don't mean business lobbies exclusively. I don't mean the AFL-CIO or the environmental groups or IPIF or whomever. I mean there are people promoting myths about trade to advance their agenda, and Americans are confused about really what trade is. Rob talks about 4 myths in his National Review article. I agreed with some of it. I disagree with other parts. Rather than address it now, maybe we can do it in Q&A. I have my own myths that are in this book, and let me just touch on a few of them. One is this notion that trade is a national competition. It's a competition between Team USA and the foreign team, Team USA and Team China. And the goal of exports are our points and imports for the foreign team's points, and the trade account is the scoreboard. And we have a trade deficit, so that means we're losing in trade, and of course the narrative goes we're losing because the foreign team is cheating. That is consistent with Trump's approach. It's kind of a nationalistic economic nationalism. It portrays the United States as this monolith that has one set of interests, as if one set of policies is good for all of America. But we know that if you have trade barriers on steel, that adversely affects steel using companies in the United States. So clearly that policy, just as an example, suggests that we're not monolithic and that we can't think of the country as trade as an us versus them proposition. Trade is millions of transactions on a daily basis, perhaps billions of transactions on a daily basis between people engaging in trade willingly. So to think of it as a team sport, how do you characterize imports? Half of the value of U.S. imports are intermediate goods and capital equipment, the purchases of U.S. producers. That suggests massive interdependence rather than this team. So I go into much more depth in other papers and a book that I'm working on. Corollary to that is that the trade deficit means we are losing a trade. This is an area that I think Rob and I have some disagreement. Trade deficit is not a reflection of trade policy at all. It's not an objective, shouldn't be an objective of trade policy. Our politicians speak as though it were. The Chamber of Commerce likes to point out that all of the countries with whom the United States has free trade agreements, you have them up, we have a trade surplus, so we're winning. And then the AFL-CIO will point out, well, with NAFTA and with Korea, our two biggest trade agreements, we have a trade deficit. We're looking at the wrong metric, all right? The point of trade is to allow us to specialize so that we can achieve economies of scale. We all specialize. You know, we all go to work every day. We focus on presumably our white-collar jobs here. I assume most of us don't know how to make our own clothes or build our own houses. Yet we get to enjoy those products because we take our monetized output, our salaries, and we pay somebody else to do that. That's what trade is. We've had a trade deficit for 41 straight years, and we're still standing. And I think with the world's premier reserve currency, there's always going to be demand for U.S. assets. What people talk about the trade deficit as representing leakage. We are losing economic activity to foreign countries. Well, the flip side of the trade deficit or the current account deficit is the capital account surplus. That means investment is coming back into the United States in the form of direct investment in factories, equity investment in the stock market, corporate debt, government debt. All of those forms of investment undergird value added in the United States. They undergird job creation. And in fact, there's an argument to be made that maybe it's advantageous for us to run a trade deficit because a lot of the companies that direct their foreign direct investment into the United States are best in their industry. These are companies that have performed well in Europe or in Japan or elsewhere. They bring better best business practices to the United States, and they raise averages. I did a paper a few years ago pointing out the difference in performance of foreign headquartered companies in the U.S. versus the U.S. average. We need to get away from this myth that the trade deficit is reflective of losing trade policy. Another one is that trade killed manufacturing. There's this tendency to say, trade killed manufacturing, so we should impose barriers, or so we should adopt industrial policy. Let's go back and examine the premise. Trade didn't kill manufacturing. Manufacturing is thriving. It's thriving. Year after year, it sets records with respect to value added, exports, imports, returns on investment. The thing is, we're doing it with fewer workers. And this, Rob talks about this a lot, that yes, we had 19.4 million workers in the manufacturing sector in 1979 at the peak. Today it's about 12.5. But we're making so much more with fewer workers. That's the object of economics. Overcoming scarcity. Producing more with less. I'll get back to that in a second. Another myth is that outsourcing is bad for the U.S. economy. You'll hear Trump talk about that, but he won't acknowledge the fact that 6.2 million Americans work for foreign headquartered companies here in the United States, that U.S. manufacturing there's more foreign direct investment in U.S. manufacturing than in any other country's manufacturing sector. More than twice as much as there is in China's manufacturing sector. So outsourcing tends to be complementary to this, to domestic production. Companies that move some functions abroad tend to expand at home as well in other areas. So we need to recognize that the flip side of outsourcing is insourcing, and that outsourcing enables U.S. companies to compete at home and abroad. And finally, and this is Bernie Sanders' perspective, trade only benefits the rich corporations, and and well-to-do Americans. That's just false. Trade barriers are easily absorbed by big companies. Smaller companies struggle because those barriers represent a larger cost to them. So it's smaller companies that benefit when we remove trade barriers. Likewise on the consumption side for consumers. It's lower income Americans who consume more imported products. Our tariffs in general, the average is about 2%, but we have tariff peaks on clothing, footwear, food, and housing through anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures on lumber, cement, appliances, flooring, cabinetry, nails, paint. So our tariff system, our trade policy is a very regressive tax. Life's necessities, clothing, food, and shelter. If Bernie Sanders is a progressive and he thinks progressivism means what we think it means, he should be supporting trade liberalization. So there are a lot of myths. Those are 5 of them. I know I'm short on time. I have more things I'd like to say, but I'll save it for Q&A.
Great, thanks. John.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Rob, thanks for inviting me today. Rob and I have had a number of conversations and collaborated on another think tank study, and we agreed that we share a common label. We are frustrated free traders, and I think many of the points Rob makes and made this morning, and I've heard before, are sensible and right. I put free trade under the broader umbrella of freedom. So the bias from which I start is the world got a lot better as people got freer. So about 200 years ago, it was an explosion of freedom, and that led to innovation and commerce and bourgeois values, as one recent book describes them. That really has been the source of tremendous increase in how we live. And people sort of forget, and certainly in a presidential year, where there is no perspective or context often for political discourse, the world we live in today is fundamentally different from the world 300 years ago. And the world 300 years ago was not fundamentally different from the world in the previous 300 years. I mean, the world really didn't change much until the Industrial Revolution and this ability for people, ordinary people, to have freedom, legal freedom, political freedom, and commercial freedom that led to innovation. So I'm a big fan of freedom, and I begin with the premise that if I want to buy a shirt or sell a shirt, I really don't want the government in the middle of that exchange. Unless there's fraud involved or some other obvious reasons, it shouldn't be the government's job or purpose to try to steer those voluntary exchanges in one direction or another. We will benefit from having more freedom and letting people making their own choices. The second point I would make is trade. Well, obviously that's the topic today, so that's what I'll confine my remarks to, but Rob touched on this. Trade policy is one piece of the puzzle when you talk about having a thriving economy, and it is, relatively speaking, a small part of it. Our tax policy, our regulatory policy, our education policy, frankly, having a rule of law system. Those are the determinants of whether we will have a thriving economy. So the policies inside the border, frankly, matter a heck of a lot more than the policies at the border. But those policies are important and important enough for us to gather today to talk about them. So let me one last point, and then I'll get to the particular topic of how to restore faith in trade policy. Whenever you're doing an assessment of trade policy, everyone wants to, at least the critics, want to talk about imports. Well, you have to talk about exports too. So in fairness, whenever you're assessing, the benefits or the lack of benefits with respect to trade policy, make sure you're looking at both sides of the ledger, because that's critical. So how do we restore faith in the trading system? Number one, I will say, and maybe here I disagree a little bit with Dan, I do think we're in a new terrain here. I don't think this is just a spike in the political, every 4 years you see a spike in the rhetoric around trade. That is true. And it's always dangerous to say, well, this time is different, but I do think this time is different. And I think this is tied to other concerns in the electorate about where the economy is going. So I don't think this focus on trade will go away soon, and I think we should look at some changes, which I'll get to. So 3 steps that I would recommend to restore faith in the trading system as we have known it, and frankly, the trading system has benefited this country since Bretton Woods and the post-World War II agreements to liberalize trade. One is we need to refocus and remind ourselves the primary lens through which trade policy should be viewed is through the eyes of the consumer. And I would analogize it to the wisdom of our founding fathers in drafting the Constitution. They included the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, boils down to the fathers knew that apple growers in Massachusetts would have incentive to go to their state legislature and say, hey, we want the good people of Massachusetts to be eating apples grown here in good old Massachusetts, not those crappy apples grown in New Jersey. And there is a natural flow of water where politicians and business leaders will get together and frankly conspire against the consumers. And the founding fathers has the wisdom to know that if they put that in the Constitution, they will prevent states from implementing those discriminatory measures. The same logic that argues against interstate discrimination applies to international discrimination. Again, consumers should have the ability to the broadest marketplace with the most competition that will lead to better prices, as Carolyn said, better innovation. That is the starting point for, I think, formulating a trade policy. Secondly, though, I think the trade enforcement, if you will, looking outside in the rest of the world, I actually think that should be viewed through the eyes of producers, because the goal of trade agreements and trade rules is to establish the proverbial level playing field. And different people will use different metrics when they decide whether the playing field is level or not. But that needs to be, I think, the focus of our enforcement policy, if you will, is are our producers being treated fairly around the world, and are they being treated fairly here at home with regard to, quote, unfair producers who are bringing their goods and services to the United States. And I'm going to come back to that. So that's the second step I think we need to make. The third one is, and this has been touched upon by each of the other speakers this morning, is what do you do about dislocated workers? And we need to do something. And I don't, again, it all sort of gets focused on trade, and trade is the cause of all the job dislocations. Clearly not, but it's part of it, and that needs to be acknowledged. And I think has not been acknowledged enough in the past, where the trade debate has been dominated by, I will use a term that John Gardner many years ago used, uncritical lovers and unloving critics. So the trade debate has been people who knee-jerk say, I haven't met a trade agreement that I didn't like, and others who just fundamentally do not support opening up a global economy and embracing the competitive challenges that invites. But the people that are dislocated due to trade or due to technology, whatever the cause, and frankly, we're probably going to see more dislocation due to technology. I mean, we're on the front end of driverless vehicles. There are many jobs in this country where people drive for a living. So we are, I think, on the front end of having to deal with an economy that is going to churn even faster. That is good news from a productivity perspective, but it will have societal challenges that cannot be ignored, and I think we're on the front end of that debate. Let me come back, though, to the main thing I want to talk about today, and I think it's the main thing that Rob discussed in his remarks. And that is, well, what do you do when our trading partners aren't abiding by the rules as we understand them? Well, one option is to do nothing and take the sort of what I would say is maybe the classical response of some economists, which is, hey, if other countries want to send us their subsidized goods, that's good for our consumers, we should welcome it. And the analogy that's often used is, look, we don't, just because the other country is mining their harbors, we don't mine our harbors. And I understand the logic of that. I personally don't think it's politically sustainable to take that approach. The second option is to, kind of muddle through, which is what we've been doing. And I don't mean that as pejoratively as it sounds. There's a lot to be said for muddling through. The world is a messy place, and not every injustice can be avenged when you're talking about a global trading system. And that was, I'll use myself as an example. When I was general counsel in 2004, by the way, at the risk of immodesty, I was the general counsel that brought the WTO case against Europe and against Airbus. So I was pleased to see the good result yesterday. 12 years ago, I never thought that dispute would still be going on, frankly. But I'm glad that, I'm not glad it's still going on. I'm glad that the merits are winning out as I had hoped they would. So, you muddle through, and, China, I'll use an example. 10 years ago, I think the assumption was, look, China is entering the WTO. They undertook many, many domestic reforms as a price of entry to the WTO, and that should not be overlooked. That China today is a much more vibrant economy and welcoming economy than it was a dozen years ago. But I think the assumption back then was, look, we'll have some bumps in the road, but over time, China is going to move towards, what was then commonly referred to as the Washington Consensus of open markets, and they will move there because that has been revealed as the most productive economic model out there. And I would say that 10 years hence, and 10 years down the road now, that optimism with regard to where the Chinese economy is going has subsided. And there's no shortage of business leaders who are frankly frustrated with the lack of openness and access that they have had in China. They are probably reluctant to talk about it publicly because they're doing business there. But I would say it is definitely the muddle through, the case to just muddle through, I think was stronger 10 years ago than it is today. So the third option is we don't just muddle through. We take this moment and take the message from the electorate. I am publicly on record as not supporting Donald Trump, but Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both certainly tapped into a lot of angst out there, and we have a democracy, and that angst is going to have to be addressed. Hopefully it'll be addressed in a positive way. I think with regard to trade enforcement, and this is my third and last option, is the option, as you might imagine, that I currently support, and that is that we don't just muddle through, that we recreate or introduce new tools for enforcement. Ultimately, reciprocity is what is needed, I think, from an economic policy perspective, and I think it's also what is necessary from a political legitimacy perspective. Everyone understands reciprocity. Everyone understands fairness. So if our goods and services, if their goods and services are being welcomed here, if their businesses are able to invest here and do business, then it is not wrong to assume that a reciprocal level of opportunity is available in our trading partners' economy. And that isn't always true. And I think one of the changes that has been revealed to me at least, is the Uruguay round and the dispute settlement understanding. Many of you in this audience were, I'm not sure if you were around in 1993, but in the early 90s, one of the major agreements was the Uruguay round and to create, quote, enforceable trade disputes. So the knock on the previous system of GATT enforcement was that countries could just ignore an adverse decision. And that wasn't satisfactory, obviously. So the idea was, let's have enforceable trade enforcement. The trade-off of that, though, was that countries would have to forego self-help measures. So in a normal rule of law system, that makes sense. You know, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, assuming it's not a trivial matter of, them leaving their, kid's bike on your lawn, you don't avail yourself of the law and enforcing the law. You either call the sheriff or you bring a lawsuit. There is an independent adjudicator of fact and law to sort this out. But we don't avail ourselves of self-help measures. So we gave up the ability to have these self-help measures. So right now we have two tools in the toolbox on trade enforcement. One is you get on a plane, you go to the other country and say, you need to stop doing this. And oh, by the way, there's two reasons you should stop doing this. One, it hurts us, but two, it really hurts you too, because you should be more open and welcoming and welcome competition, and that's the whole basis of having a global trading rule system. And then they often will say, well, thank you for your views and what time's your flight? And nothing much happens. Your next option, the other tool in the toolbox, is to sue them. And you go to Geneva and you find it out. And as Rob noted, we had a good result yesterday. But I think the having only two options, I'm going to wrap up. Having two options, job owning or going to Geneva, I don't think is satisfactory. I think we're going to need to fill in some other tools in the toolbox that hopefully won't lead to trade vigilanteism, but I think will be necessary to both get some leverage over our trading partners to abandon their own protectionist measures, but also in the same breath to reestablish the political legitimacy of our rules-based system. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, thank you, John. I think Clyde is on Midwest time, so he should be here in any moment. So we'll give him like 3 minutes when he gets here. So let me just make a couple of comments, and then I want to open it up for discussion among ourselves. Just to clarify with Carolyn, I think one of the frustrations we have in this debate is sort of if you sort of start criticizing a little bit, you sort of assume that you don't understand what the benefits are. I'm not saying you're saying that, but absolutely, the benefits of globalization are consumer choice, productivity, digital labor, and I would add scale. Global scale is super important for innovation firms. So, having a fully integrated global marketplace would be the optimal, ideal solution, end game. So, I don't think when some people criticize where we are, like John, it doesn't mean that we don't understand or fully appreciate what the benefits of globalization really are. Second, you made some points, as did Dan, about sort of whether we're doing well on competitiveness. I don't think we are. I don't think you can really look at U.S. firms as being the defining measure of competitiveness. The question is really about U.S. value added. You can have strong U.S. firms that aren't here, where a lot of their production is overseas. Certainly we benefit from some of that, but we might benefit more if more of their value added was here. Dan, I probably no point in rehashing this argument. Maybe we can a little, but I would say that there's a little piece we just wrote. It's on our website, a PowerPoint I gave last week for a big manufacturing conference that really did try to rebut this notion that all is well in manufacturing. To say things like, well, yeah, U.S. manufacturing is at an all-time high, exports are at an all-time high. It doesn't really tell you anything. I would hope it's at an all-time high. GDP is at an all-time high. So the reality is as manufacturing done as well And the answer is clearly no. Real value added of U.S. manufacturing is below 2007 levels today. So yeah, it's growing over, say, 15 years, but it's below 2007 levels. It's growing much slower than GDP growth. And when it's measured properly, you see big declines in output. So I don't think we can just sort of blithely assume that, everything is good in the economy. That's not to say that we're a Portuguese basket case or a Greek basket case. We're not, and still have an enormous amount of strengths. But again, I see this debate as kind of a Manichaean debate where you're either doing great or we're doing terrible. We're doing pretty well, but I want to do better. And I think there's things we could do that would get us there. And I guess the other thing, I understand why the debate gets framed this way, because there are a lot of unreconstructed protectionists out there who just don't like globalization and they don't want it. But I kind of go with John's point of, they're either, you've never met a free trade agreement you don't love, or you've never met one you like. There is a middle ground. There's a third way here. And I don't think we should, I really think we need to get away from this discussion of protectionism or free versus free trade or economic nationalism versus enlightened globalism. And I don't think, Carolyn, that the choice was between full steam ahead and the let's stop and have a timeout. I don't think we should have a timeout. I think it'd be a terrible idea to have a timeout. I want to keep going ahead. I just want to, instead of going this way, I want to go that way. I want to do what John wants to do, which is introduce new regimes and new disciplines. So I don't see the debate as between stopping and going. I see it as let's go, but let's do it in a slightly different way. So I guess I would just ask Dan a question. Oh, by the way, also just last one. I really love, John, your sort of for position, because I think that is exactly the right. We sort of have this, the nothing, do nothing position, which I'm going to say that's Dan's position, but you can correct me if I'm wrong if I'm a moment. Dan, you seem like, we're going to keep doing okay. Nothing to do. They'll muddle through, which is sort of what we've been doing. The get tougher, but still keep going forward, which is John's position, I would argue, and mine is our position here. And then the kind of Bernie Sanders, Trump, anti-TPP crowd, protectionism and isolation, which is clearly the wrong position. So Dan, my question would be for you, should we care about, just to use this as a case example, should we care about the fact that the European Union, assuming we agree with the WTO ruling, which we fully do, should we care about that they engage in massive subsidies? And let me actually back it up here. Would you care if the U.S. government massively subsidized? Would Cato support massive launch subsidies for Boeing, the next Boeing jet? Would Cato support that?
Well, I speak for myself.
Okay.
My colleagues might have different.
Would you support it?
No.
Okay. Let me ask you another. Would you support a policy in the U.S. that says it's now legal to download any movie you want at any time if you don't pay for it?
That it's legal to do so? I'm not sure yet.
Okay. All right. How about, would you support a policy that says that the U.S. government forces all...
John, can I secure your services? I need a lawyer.
Advice and counsel.
Plead the Fifth Amendment. All right. Where were you last year on congressional hearing? Last question. Would you support a policy of the U.S. government that says all foreign firms here, Toyota and Siemens and all, as a condition of doing business here, they have to turn over their patents to their foreign competitors?
No, but I think...
Okay. Here's my point. But you do sort of say it's okay for China to do that.
No, I don't. I say it's okay for U.S. companies to make their own decisions as to whether they want to acquiesce to those demands. Each company can decide for itself. There's no such thing as U.S. property or U.S. technology.
So it is okay for China to do these things?
Well, I mean, I think that we should be negotiating to have a set of rules that we all abide by. But I'm saying that it's we shouldn't view U.S. Company actions as reflective of the whole national entity. Right? Companies have their own choices.
Sure, but I assume the reason that you, and I would assume most of your Cato colleagues, don't support these kinds of policies here at home is because you, in most cases, would rightly agree that they're distortionary and would end up hurting U.S. economics. But
I favor
now-
having rules.
Right, but now as we go beyond that and we have really a global economy, the idea that somehow what other countries do doesn't affect us or the global economy. But I don't understand why you would not have the same sort of laser-like Cato focus against what these other countries do.
Why are you assuming that I don't? I mean,
I just don't hear it. But please let me know that I'm wrong. I just don't hear it, I guess.
well, you're wrong. You are.
Okay, I'm wrong.
Let me
Glad you heard that.
you mentioned earlier about blithely suggesting that manufacturing is doing no favor. My analysis comes from the data. I look at the same data that you look at, I think, and see different numbers and reach different conclusions. What I want to get to is, I don't just want to sit back and do nothing. Maybe I suggested at the outset, but this is the takeaway that I want to leave with you guys. And that is, trade is one role, and that is to grow the pie. Trade is disruptive, just like technology is disruptive. But we don't have a trade adjustment assistance program or a technology adjustment assistance program for people who lose their jobs because of all of the apps on your iPhone that used to be other jobs. Every one of these apps was somebody's job at one point. So we shouldn't.
Not the beer drinking one.
So trade's job is to grow the pie. It's the job of domestic policymakers and individuals to overcome labor market frictions. There are a lot of frictions. There are a lot of frictions that are impeding adjustment. And this is to get something that John said. It's the environment that you want to create in the United States. We're not competing for export markets. We are competing for investment and value added in the United States. And we are still the number one destination.
But
for
it's a
investment. But it's a function of the policies that you have in place.
So trade is supposed to grow the pie.
Yes.
Does European launch aid grow the pie?
Artificially. Yeah, I mean, it
How
does grow.
How does European launch aid grow our pie?
Oh, our pie.
Well, first of all, how does it grow?
Maybe grows their pie. Yeah.
Okay, but does it grow the global pie?
But this is a different question.
No, I don't think so, because you oppose domestic launch aid.
Yes.
So clearly, because you think it would detract from
I
the
say
U.S. pie, but how can you then not have the same view towards European launch aid for the global pie?
you're putting words in my mouth.
Well, no, I'm asking a question. Do you think that
I don't
European
think it should
launch
be launch
aid?
aid at all. I don't think it should be industrial policy, which you advocate for.
Let's just stick with launch aid.
Okay. No, my point is, if we have a cabal of smart people in Washington deciding which industries to support.
We're not. These are the cabal of smart people in Brussels who decided this. And do we think that? Really simple question. Do you think that that is good for the global economy?
No.
Okay. Should we do anything about it?
Yeah, we should bring cases to the WTO.
All right. Now we've done that, and the only John, you're the trade lawyer here, but seems like the only option we have now, other than hoping they'll abide by it, is retaliatory tariffs that the WTO approves. That seems like our only option. Would you support that?
I think the WTO system is very smart in the way that retaliation, you come up with a list of retaliation, and you put the ball back in Europe's court, right? And you say, you know what, we're going to go after these products, we're going to retaliate against these products. And then there's a debate within Europe as to whether it brings to the table interests that didn't really care very much about this issue, and it gets resolved.
So,
but
we would support retaliatory tariffs.
I would support the threat of it.
They sound like Trump.
I
Threatening. But what if the Europeans are listening to this and they over in Brussels in live thing and they go, the U.S. government is going to follow Dan's advice, so they'll carry a big stick, but speak loudly, but carry a soft stick. If we threaten it, it's not meaningless, then you don't support them.
I support the way the system works. I think it's worked pretty well. By the way, if all the 163 WTO members, the United States is more likely to be out of compliance than any other country. We are less likely to bring our laws and regulations into conformity because we can endure retaliation.
Carolyn, did you want to jump in?
I wanted to actually ask you a question because it seems like the system is working. I think the WTO case worked the way it should. We should threaten retaliatory tariffs. Hopefully they'll stop doing what they're doing. It's a duopoly. It's two firms, so there is an incentive for each side to try and steal more of the pie in the aircraft. It's different from competitive industry. that incentive is there. It's a prisoner's dilemma. So each side tries, but you have to have a competitive equilibrium, and that's exactly a cooperative equilibrium. That's exactly what the WTO creates. But you said that that you want more enforcement. So what mechanisms are you talking about specifically that go beyond what we currently have?
So first of all, I don't think this is a cooperative game. The U.S. doesn't. I think I rejected the original WTO case with regard to Boeing subsidy. I don't think they were subsidies. So we don't have a policy to artificially prop up our domestic aviation, aerospace industry. What policies? Well, I'm going to wait and see whether we actually whether we do follow through aggressively with retaliatory tariffs. The first step, and then if they call our bluff because they think that Dan's bluffing, then are we going to do it? But I don't. I mean, there's two parts of your question. The second part of the question is that's an easy case in many ways. It's sort of pure subsidy, and the WTO is designed in a way that in theory can handle those cases. Much of what's going on in China is beyond the WTO. It's not designed for the WTO rules, which is why, by the way, we're such big supporters of TPP, because it puts in place better regimes that are really more designed around some of the 21st century problems. So here's a good case. The Chinese are investing upwards of $140 billion to artificially prop up and create a global semiconductor industry. This will be incredibly damaging to the global economy because it will end up cutting the revenues of the global innovators who will invest less in R&D, and we're going to take a lot longer to get innovation in semiconductors. But they're doing it in a very clever way that, well, first of all, we're not bringing a WTO case against them. Why aren't we? U.S. firms don't want to get retaliated. They know they will get retaliated even more. So
we're too busy bringing lots of other cases as well.
Oh, yeah, on chicken. But I don't think, that to me is one way that the system's not working right now. Our companies will not bring cases because they know the government will retaliate against them. The second way it's not working is the Chinese are very, very smart. They funneled money through their SOEs into this, quote, private company, and now they can say, this isn't government subsidy, this is venture capital. I don't know that the WTO regime is designed, I mean, it's still government money, but would we win that case? And I guess I'm not enough of a trade lawyer to say, what are all the various things, what are all the various rules? John has a really great idea that your op-ed in the Hill, John, with regard to the International Trade Commission thing. You might want to talk about that. I'm not enough of a trade lawyer to say what are all those specific things. What I do think, though, is the system's not working adequately, and we need people like you and John and Dan and others to, think about how do we get to this piece that John's talking about, which is this next level. That would be my answer. Why don't we open it, unless anybody had any, why don't we just open it up for comments or questions? We'll go right here. Yes, sir. Right here, and then here and here. And wait for the mic. There you go.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wanted to make an observation here. I'm a professor of international business, so I'm not a trade economist. And when I look at what is behind you, it's that policy ideas for the innovation economy. If you look at the value chain, the focus on trade is at the end of the value chain. You already have the product produced, and then you ship the products to other countries or sell to other countries. That's really the past. If we are really serious about innovation economy, we should look at the more upstream. That is research and development. That's investment. Now, granted, globalization with job loss, etc., has created a lot of anger. And there are two things that have been mentioned, but only one is more focused in conversation or discussion, and that is the assistance program. That means the workers need to be retrained, etc. But what is more important is that we need investment in new and emerging industries, so there will be jobs. And I don't think we have talked enough about investment in new and emerging economies. And I'm glad that, Dan talked about foreign direct investment. The focus on trade is not a complete conversation. We need to talk about global trade and investment. Increasing the investment is what drives the global economy. It's not trade. So I just want to repeat that we are focusing on the end of the value chain. We should now focus more on the upstream, investment in R&D, investment in innovation, investment in advanced technologies. And I fully agree with what Ben and Carol are saying here, is we really need to look at investment more and not just the trade. Just an observation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Good morning. Jerome LaRoche. I'm at the Netherlands Embassy in DC, so I'm European. I've been listening with interest to this discussion. I'm not going to defend Airbus subsidies because I'm totally against them, and we have been quite strong on that from the Netherlands perspective. But that was not the question I was wanting to ask. My question is: haven't we become in the sort of the trade experts world rather complacent with explaining what we've done and what it has led to? I think your soccer or sports analogy was very powerful, because our politicians have tried to take all the credits when things were going right because of trade liberalization, and now are denying, now things look a little bit less positive, are blaming all this on trade. When actually, I think global trade and open markets have brought enormous benefits to us. We just haven't actually given trade credit for that. We said, no, it was our own domestic economic policies, and look what I've done as a president, and look at how I made the US economy grow. When in fact, if you look at what's happened, it's rather globalization and global growth that has driven domestic growth, I think, in almost all Western economies. So shouldn't we give trade more credit politically for that?
Yes, we should.
I think President Obama supports the TPP, but I don't think he's been a very strong spokesman for trade. I mean, each of the State of Union addresses he's given, he speaks about trade in sort of a defensive way. We have to liberalize. We need TPP, or else China's going to eat our lunch. It needs to be advocated better than that. I was very frustrated in 2012 with Mitt Romney and Obama accusing each other of being more responsible for outsourcing rather than spending time to explain the benefits. But it turns out, and this must be the case since politicians never talk about the benefits, or very rarely do, that it's just too hard. They figure it's too hard to explain how the process through which trade, the creative destruction and all that, it's not saleable at the political level. And I think that's a problem we need to overcome. And we talked about the deplorables, about kind of looking down on people who don't understand the benefits of trade. And that's what you point out in your op-ed, Rob. Politicians need to figure out a way. We need to put before them a way for them to explain this from the stump, that this is good.
I think the only place where it's worked, actually, of explaining the benefits of trade is Europe in the earlier phases of European integration, where in part because the social safety net is so much stronger, and because there was a kind of, as well, a political side to it, the benefits were recognized, maybe less so.
So what I want to do, I'm going to let Clyde kind of get the feeling of the room here for a moment, and then we'll probably go like 5 minutes longer just to let Clyde, and then I want to ask Clyde to say a few things, but I want to go to the question. Before I do that, and we'll go right here, by the way, next for the mic. But before I do that, look, I understand that. I guess my major frustration in this debate is we keep framing it as, oh yeah, there are benefits of trade, or there are not. Like, yes, there are huge benefits of trade, but it's kind of like saying, there are benefits of drinking water, but when you drink water that's polluted, the benefits aren't very good. And there are clearly the parts of the global trading system that aren't working well. For example, what China is doing in many of these areas, other countries that are engaged in forced localization, And I don't know why we can't have an argument and a discussion that says, yeah, there are always wonderful things about trade. Market, competition, consumer benefits, productivity, and scale. Great. But there are also some other problems that we have to nip in the bud, we have to extinguish if we want to get more of those benefits. And it just, to me, is not a black and white Manichaean debate. I don't think trade people should be that defensive. I mean, I feel like the trade advocates are so defensive that if they don't sort of put this 100% positive spin on it, that they're just going to give aid and comfort to the reactionary nativists and protectionists. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think we don't articulate a more nuanced perspective. It just forces people into this protectionist camp. We'll go right here and then try to keep on. Yeah.
I'm Jason Stern. I'm CEO of Brady Communications. We do a book called The World is Your Market. It goes out through a lot of small company associations. The reason I wanted to bring this up, there are 28 million small companies. Out of that, only 1% really export at this point. Some go on eBay, they go on Alibaba, and they do these other things. But when it comes down to real trade, like America's Small Business Development Centers, who I work very closely with, and they help and reach about 1.1 million companies. The point I'm trying to make right now is this. The U.S. Commercial Service has been cut back in what they can help small companies. They have 109 centers that help small companies. Small Business Development Centers have about 1,000 centers. They help in trade as well. But when it really comes down to policy, you have whether the Ex-Im Bank, and I work with their small business department, they don't have the money to engage our own small companies. If you want to grow economies, you're going to need these local economies to grow through small companies. There's no other way to do it.
Okay, why don't we turn it over? So I guess the question would be, would it help with globalization support in the U.S. if we did more to help our exporters with assistance, particularly our SME exporters? I vote yes. Other thoughts here? Yes, no?
I vote yes for political support, and it's very important that everybody has the opportunity, but the big companies are the most productive and account for a really large share of exports for a reason. And so we need the big companies as well. I think it's dangerous to always look to the small companies for growth, because historically, actually, big companies have provided more growth in exports and more diversification in exports if you look at the statistics.
Sure.
We should help to lower the costs for small businesses by negotiating agreements like the TPP, where you have a customs chapter where information needs to be public. It makes it easier for small companies to comply. But we don't need to subsidize trade missions, and we don't need to have a national export initiative funneling money at particular companies.
So let me just quickly introduce Clyde, and then Clyde, a few minutes on your thoughts on it, and you're kind of coming in a little bit at the end of this, but I think you kind of get the drift of it. Clyde, because you don't know, Clyde is the founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute, and he's really been both the real front lines when you were in the when you were in the Reagan administration, and then the intellectual front lines of this debate for a long, long time, and has done really groundbreaking work and multiple books on the issues around international trade policy and economic competitiveness. Been involved in congressional passage of NAFTA, the Uruguay round, and a whole set of other things. And I'm assuming you have a new book out, because you always do every time I see you. So, Clyde.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Let me apologize for being very late. I think my younger son has captured it well. He says, "Dad, your brain is turning to toothpaste." And there's truth in that. But this is a topic that, as Rob said, I've been considering for a long time. So, as long as I've been in Washington, which I came here in 1981 for a year, and the year has turned into 35. So as long as I've been here, there's been this debate, free trade, kind of black and white debate, free trade or protectionism. And that has morphed into debate of globalization or protectionism. And I think, as Rob indicated, it's always has been, and increasingly is, a false debate. Free trade is a word that actually has many meanings, and this means different things in different circumstances. If I give a speech to an audience, maybe like this, and I say, how many people are for free trade? Almost every hand goes up. If I then say, okay, I guess that by free trade, you people mean that the United States removes its trade barriers, tariffs, etc., and opens its markets to imports, and that our trading partners do the same. And every hand goes up. Yep, that's what we mean by free trade. But that is actually not what many economists mean by free trade. Many economists mean by free trade, this is what we might describe as unilateral free trade. You open your markets, you'd like the other guy to open his markets, but if he doesn't, you're still better off opening your markets than falling into some protectionist tit for tat. Now, Ralph Gomery, the former chief scientist at IBM and former chairman of the Sloan Foundation, the Nobel Prize winner, and his colleague Bill Baumol, a former president of the American Economic Association, published a book several years ago on international trade and conflict. And it was interesting, they did the book in two forms. When you open the book, you first encountered a plain English written explanation of what they had done. And then at the end of that, you got into the mathematical book, which went through countless complicated equations to show what they had done to mathematicians and to mathematized economics. But the conclusion on both parts of the book was that trade is sometimes a win-win proposition. Sometimes it's win-lose, zero-sum. And it can even be lose-lose. And their message was to policymakers to be serious about distinguishing between the kinds of trade that were being negotiated or that were being agreed upon or that were de facto occurring. Now, jump ahead, just 2 days ago, the New America Foundation had a full-day session on China. And Orville Schell, a longtime China expert from Columbia University, spoke along with a number of other people. But what struck me about the presentation and about the whole day was the repetition of the concept that we actually live in a world of mercantilism. And that many of the biggest, fastest growing economies are mercantilist. And that we, the US, are not responding adequately to that kind of mercantilism. Now, let me give you then a personal example of the kind of situation that I think American industry and Washington increasingly find itself in. I have served on the advisory board and on the boards of various tech companies, including several high-tech companies. I won't mention any names, but I was involved in one particular case in which the high-tech company, a Silicon Valley company, makes the vast bulk of its products in the United States. The product, of course, is high-tech. It's not labor-intensive. It's capital-intensive. It's technology-intensive, but not labor-intensive. The company believes that on an operating cost basis, it is the world's low-cost producer in the United States. That is to say that its production base in the U.S. is a lower cost production base than China or Ireland or wherever. It also believes that the quality produced at its American base is better than the quality produced in some of the other locations in which it operates. So this company, over the years, came under a lot of pressure to move production to China. And there were several considerations. It is a high-tech product. It's something in which U.S. technology is ahead of Chinese technology. The Defense Department is interested in this leadership in technology. It's low-cost producer in the U.S. Why move? It has better quality in the U.S. Why move? But every time that an executive of this company would go to China, all that person would hear from Xi Jinping all the way down, or Hu Jintao all the way down to the factory floor, was, when are you going to put your factory in China? Don't you know that you have to maintain a high image in China? Now that little comment, don't you know that you have to maintain, is a hidden threat. Essentially it's saying, look, you got to understand, we're not a country of rule of law. If you don't do these things, who knows what might happen. On the other hand, there's also a carrot. If you were to put your factory here in China, how much does the factory cost? Oh, about $8 billion. Okay, we could give you the land free. We could give you the utilities at half cost. No taxes for 25 years. We could make a capital grant of $2 billion. How would that look? Now, I said on purpose initially that the operating cost in the U.S. is lower. But with the bennies, throw in and then look at the total financial cost, suddenly the benefit shifts to China. So this company, in fact, did move some very high technology production to China. Now, did anybody in the U.S. government even know about this dynamic or bring it to the attention of policymakers? Did anybody in this spanned Republican and Democratic administrations? This was not a partisan kind of discussion. Did anybody in those administrations take any serious look at the long-term implications? I mean, the U.S. has, or I don't know today if it does, it did at the time, had a trade surplus with China in that particular product line. I think it probably does not today, or if it does, it's much reduced because this company accounted for a large part of that surplus. Did anybody look at that in the government and think about, geez, what does this mean long term? Well, not seriously, no. I mean, it was brought to the attention of some government officials. But they were captive of an ideology. They were captive of an orthodoxy that has taken grip of Washington since the 1950s. But that orthodox grip is, we call it free trade. And consequently, we tell ourselves it's always win-win. Well, Gomery and Baumol are saying, no, look at it carefully. It's not always win-win. If it's not always win-win, then you need to get away from the mathematical models because they don't incorporate the key assumptions. And you need to think about it strategically. So I think this is where Rob and I would agree that the Washington consensus fails. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Clyde. So let's just take 5 more minutes. I don't think it's just ideology. I think it is ideology. I think it also is just lack of institutional capacity. There is really no capability of the U.S. government in a serious way to do analytics on an ongoing basis, to understand what's going on, and what, if anything, we should do that. And that's something the next administration, I think, regardless of who it should be, should fix. So I'm going to go kind of in the order I saw. I saw you here first, sir, and then here.
Hi, I'm Theron Gray. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University. I tend to agree with Mr. Verneau's kind of gloomy outlook on the trade argument kind of persisting in our domestic politics kind of endlessly. But I noticed that even in my peers and the Bernie Bro movement, who are all still against TPP, for example. But I wonder if you see some light at the end of the tunnel, just in the fact that millennials, as we continue to be the largest generation, and will hopefully get jobs soon, our innate ability to program and to work with computers will help change the way the argument is framed and will help to subside some of the issues of worker assistance and relocation, because we're inherently able to move and live with an iPhone and program things. So thank you.
I think you'll be fine.
Especially if you want to move to China. Okay, actually, right over here, you had your hand up first, and then there would be 2 more questions.
I can be loud without the mic. Hi, Jen Riccardi from the EU. Ambassador Verno, I tend to agree with you when you said that it feels different this time, the politicians' resistance to trade or opposition to trade. I like to think that 6 to 12 months from now, there'll be a pivot from whomever is elected, and they'll turn back to trade. And my question is to the panel, in light of this, how different this feels, it seems to me that they're going to have to come up with a way to put their mark on trade, to say it's different now. I can't support TPP because I made these changes. Now I can move forward with TTIP agenda because of these changes. I think you nailed, one idea, which is beefing up enforcement. What else might there be available to candidates to remake the trade agenda in their image in a way that's palatable to their supporters?
Don, you want to
Very
start?
quickly, I think it will need to be more enforcement, more focus on enforcement. But I also think the country will be more politically and economically able to embrace an economy that is going to churn even more if people feel that there are institutions and policies in place that can help people in the adjustment, whether that churning and dislocation is due to trade or some other reason. But I think, I'm told, as long as people feel like they are totally on their own, and I'm not calling for massive government programs, especially with Dan sitting next to me, but I do think we need a different social contract to get people comfortable with an economy that's going to churn faster.
And what would your thoughts, or what would your advice be to the next administration to do that? And actually, why don't we wrap up on this question?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly let's not have a technology tax, and let's not, impede other vehicles that creative destruction. I think, quite frankly, Hillary Clinton, if she's elected, will find it pretty easy to pivot back and support the TPP. The TPP hasn't been sold the way it should be sold, and that is global trade liberalization is broken down at the multilateral level. The TPP is the next generation. Instead of achieving consensus with 163 countries around the table to liberalize trade, we're achieving critical mass, 40% of global economic output, a third of trade. Join us. These are the rules. Those who complain about China, well, there are rules here to discipline China. And China is clearly going to want to join when it sees the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand and Korea and possibly Taiwan join on. So as TPP gets larger and larger, the costs of remaining out are going to grow. So I think that case needs to be made. It's not about beating China to writing the rules of trade, but it is about inviting China to join, but disciplining some of the behaviors that have been complained about. So.
Carol, what would you advise the next administration in terms of how would we be able to work, particularly on TTIP?
Well, I would agree with a lot of what Dan said. I just wanted to say about enforcement, I think one of the problems with it is we're always fighting the last battle. And so while I completely agree that we need better enforcement, I think the problem is that you see the last battle. So currency manipulation is the last battle that we're fighting now. And there are some ideas out there by my colleagues, which we're debating within the Institute a lot on addressing, but often the solutions are more distortionary than the problem is itself. And now there are new methods to get around it, so it can just switch. So it's not even clear how effective it could be. So China's no longer manipulating its currency. In terms of advice to the administration, I agree. I think, and I said that in my opening remarks, TPP actually are the rules that provides the rules that we want for trade. I think another possibility would be actually if the Europeans got on board to put TTIP ahead of TPP, I think it's a lot less contentious.
So, excuse me. I've been a supporter of TTIP and an opponent of TTP, but honestly, I think that TTIP it's going to be very difficult to pull it off. And I think that TPP furthers essentially. I mean, the rules are in some ways better and do provide some new enhancements, but essentially it's the same old thing. And Dan mentioned the failure of global trade negotiations, and that's certainly true. But TPP is the next extension kind of these global negotiations. It's based on the same premises, and I think that it would further what we kind of already have, maybe at a higher level. So if I were Hillary or Trump in this game, I think I would go in a way all the way back to the beginning, back to Bretton Woods, 1944. And you may remember, well, you may not remember, you probably don't remember, so it's a long time ago. But there was a lot of concern at that time about trade imbalances. And the system was designed to try to avoid trade imbalances. John Maynard Keynes went so far as to propose a global currency. He called it Bancor. And his big complaint, the cause of fundamental argument between Keynes and Harry Dexter White from the U.S. was that the system that the IMF established was one that enabled the IMF to provide rescue loans to countries that were in economic trouble, particularly if they were in trade imbalance. They had chronic trade imbalances, and the IMF was there to provide them loans, but also to impose guidance on them as to how to fix their economies so they wouldn't be running chronic trade imbalances. And Keynes said, that's good, but he said, what we haven't provided for is any discipline on countries that run chronic trade surpluses. We have no mechanism here to cause them to change mercantilist policies that might result in chronic trade surpluses. Well, Harry Dexter White won the argument. The U.S. was obviously in a much more powerful position than the U.K. at that time. And we wound up with the system that initially was fixed exchange rates. And then, of course, the IMF neglected or politically wasn't able to adjust exchange rates, the fixed exchange rates, as they got out of balance. And eventually, in 1972, Nixon blew the system up by floating the dollar. But then, since that time, we have been plagued with continuing trade imbalances. The U.S. particularly has become the buyer of last resort. The role of the U.S. in the global economy is primarily to consume and to borrow. It structurally puts the U.S. in a position in which every year we know that we're going to add 5, 6, maybe $700 billion of debt to our international debt position, which is already quite large. So it means we're consuming more than we're producing, and effectively we're transferring wealth-producing capacity abroad. Now, this can go on for quite a long time because we're a very rich country, and we borrow in our own currency, and at today's interest rates, it doesn't look very expensive, but it can't go on forever. So what I would argue is that a new president or presidential candidate should make achieving trade balance an important part of the program. Now, the theory of course, has always been that trade is win-win, but of course, even the devotees of complete free trade understand that some industries, some people may be losers. And so the argument has been for years that the winners will compensate the losers. But they don't. And they never will. The winners are powerful, the losers are not. And the losers will unlikely have the power to force some kind of compensation. So to aim at balance, and to do that by mechanisms that are acceptable and justified under current trade rules is both possible and I think advisable. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just real quickly, I would do two things. I would call, as soon as I were elected, I would call for a 90-day review of trade enforcement policies and bring together people like on the panel here and really dig down and look at all the things we can be doing that we aren't doing now, things that we could be doing if we had congressional approval, the things we could be doing if we had more international support for it. Second thing I would do would be to pick 2 or 3 big things on a competitiveness agenda. One has to be lowering the effective corporate tax rate in the U.S. I think another has to be much more support for R&D, pre-competitive R&D, and then there's many, many other things you can imagine might go into that kind of agenda. So with that, I appreciate your patience. We're normally pretty disciplined on time here, but
I'm not,
for
sorry.
some reason we had to go over here. But I will say, I think we came up with a strong consensus here on the panel. I think everybody can support the statement that free trade can be good.